Stephanie Draper. I'm the CEO of Bond, and one of the organisations that is involved in the Learning for Consortium programme, along with TPI, the Partnering Initiative, and with the support of an academic advisory board and FCDO. So great to be here, and thank you all very much for coming. It's brilliant. I think we've got nearly 100 people here with us today, so that's very indicative of how important this agenda is. And for us, it's a really the Learning for Consortia work is a really critical programme because it brings together insights from learning about what we do, but also how do we do that collaboratively. So we all know that development challenges, as they intensify, no one organisation can tackle them on their own. So we need to be working together to get the level of systemic change that we are all aspiring to, and that needs joined up thinking, but also needs a really strong foundation of learning. And so we need to be getting underneath observing what is changing, what are we learning about what supports that change, and perhaps what doesn't support that change. And that enables us not to be making the same mistakes over and over, but learning from each other's mistakes so that we can make new ones and learn from those. So this program really is about making progress on that and moving things forward. So I'll say a little bit more about the objectives of the program shortly, but the first thing to say is what we're going to do today. We have basically some introductory remarks, and then we are moving on to some breakout groups, because what we really want you to be able to do today is get under the skin of what we are learning so far, because the Learning Consortium programme is about learning from the consortium, but also sharing that learning with you. So the first breakout is very much focused on how do we create the strong foundations for consortium working, and the second is focused specifically on governance. We'll then have a quick break because we're conscious that none of us can spend hours on Zoom without coffee or beverage of your choice. And then we'll move on to a second session, which is more about adapting to changing circumstances. So clearly, we are all working in a context of extreme change, be that COVID-19 or changes to funding. And so we're looking specifically at how the consortia have responded to cuts. And then we have another break, and then some wrap up and final reflections. And we have a number of rapporteurs joining us in that final reflection space. So Anne-Marie Hemskirk from Partos, Jen Ruddick from the FCDO, Saji Rajani from the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue, and Laura Ormia from Smart Peace Consortium are going to reflect on their takeaways from this event and how that will then be reflected in their work. And then the final thing is, if you can keep yourself on mute during the session, that would be great. But if you do want to say something, do use the hand up function and turn your video on and your microphone in order to speak. We are recording the session so that it can be more widely shared, and we also have a captioner doing speech to text. So if you want captions, there is something called a closed caption function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, that you can turn on, and that will enable you to see the written word if that's needed. So that is today. Just moving on to the next slide, just to give you the full overview of the Learning for Consortia programme. It aims to improve international development by supporting learning, as I said, and it's specifically working with the 13 UK Aid Connect consortia. So consortia that are brought together to address specific issues. It's a collaboration between Bond, TPI and the Academic Advisory Board. And we have 3 specific things that we're trying to do: learn from consortia, supporting the consortia to deliver more effectively, and then also sharing the learning, which is very much what today is all about. And we're doing that by working alongside the consortia on their experiences and challenges. So I'm going to now hand over to Darian, who is going to say a little bit more about why consortia are important and how we got here, and then on to Jude, who is chair of our Academic Advisory Board, who will talk about the process of learning that we're going through. Darian.
Thank you very much indeed, Steph, and a huge welcome on behalf of TPI to everyone joining us here this afternoon for what will, we hope to be, a really fascinating discussion. And in fact, the whole program is a fascinating program because we have these 13 consortia which really are providing a living laboratory to really study how consortia can deliver as effectively as possible. And as part of that, TPI, the Partner Initiative, the organization I work for, which is an international NGO supporting collaboration and partnership all around the world, we have 4 advisors who have been almost embedded with these consortia, really trying to work with them to help them be as effective as possible, exchange that learning among them and drawing out effective practice. And these are some of the elements that we'll be talking around today, along with these consortia advisors. There's a whole range of other advisors working on various different topics, and collectively we bring together multiple different learnings for discussion. What I want to just very quickly introduce is just a couple of definitions and really understanding why consortia, as well as some of the challenges involved in consortia. And just as a sort of definition, working definition, there is no standard definition for consortia, but it is basically a group of organizations funded as a collective that together designs and delivers a program of work. And this involves a lead financial and administrative organization. And of course, individual partners might also engage with further partners, further implementing agencies on the ground. Now, consortia have many things in common with other forms of collaboration, and particularly multi-stakeholder partnerships. But actually, one big difference that it's worth understanding is that while in multi-stakeholder partnerships, partners will often be voluntarily contributing their resources towards delivering some common objective together, in consortia, a donor is usually funding all of the different members. And through a lead, there is almost always some sort of vertical accountability structure. And as we will see through the various discussions, this can cause some issues, some challenges when it comes to consortia working effectively as good partnerships. Now we're seeing a bit of a trend, several major donors, whether it's the Netherlands or the US, beginning to use consortia more and more, which is why it really is such an important topic. And interestingly, in the case of the Netherlands, a major driver for consortia was around simplification of bureaucracy, having a single large contract with one organization that then goes off and does much of the administration, rather than having to deal with multiple small value contracts. But that's just on one element of things. In fact, the reason why consortia are being used here, if we look at DFID's original reasoning, FCDO as was We recognize the world is changing, that the key development challenges are complex and interconnected. No one single development actor has all the answers. We want to support exciting and new partnerships brought together in consortia to tackle these complex challenges together. Because we work in these consortia, in the end, to deliver greater impact, to deliver more sustainable and transformational impact. And we're already beginning to see some of the evidence for this. So one consortium said, the program I'm working on is taking the systems approach to finding what is effective in reducing worst forms of child labour. This would not have been possible without the 6 partners in the consortium. So clearly the potential to deliver towards more complex, even systemic challenges is a key component here. But actually there are multiple other sort of collaborative advantages that can be gained through consortium working. And the main one, which is cited by many of the consortia, is around diversity, bringing together complementary approaches, resources, different voices that can lead to far better understanding of the problem, as well, of course, as more innovative and applicable solutions. Other benefits, the exchange of learning that happens, the potential for the development of new standards across the NGO sector. Then, of course, there's the synergies, different organizations doing similar-ish type of things or in a similar geography. By aligning programs, aligning approaches, sharing resources, we can actually deliver efficiencies and deliver more. And then, of course, the potential for scale. So the potential for multiple organizations collectively together to deliver at a scale that simply would not be possible any organization on their own. And we also know that these consortia can give considerable value to all the partners taking part, whether that's the learning that they gain from each other or the relationships and connections that have been built. This all lead to new thinking and new programs. This is all easy to say in theory. The reality is running these consortia is challenging for a whole range of different reasons, some of which we will be looking into. Anything from the formal structure of a consortium being innately hierarchical and with major power differentials, that can be a challenge when it comes to wanting to balance the qualities that we know are needed for an effective partnership, the equity, the co-creation, the co-accountability. Secondly, the organizational friction between different NGOs that work in different ways, think in different ways, use different language, etc. All of these things, all of these problems we can deal with them. They're not intractable. And paradoxically, the diversity which causes many of these challenges is also what can deliver the best solutions. And of course, that's normal times. Over the last year, AidConnect Consortia have had to go through a global pandemic, climate crisis mounting, significant reductions in funding. It makes it more and more challenging. So this is an opportunity for us collectively to look at what makes these consortia effective? How do we reduce these transaction costs, reduce these frictions, and enable partnerships to really, or consortia to really be able to deliver on their potential? Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Darian. Now handing on to Jude Franson, who is from the Open University and, as I said, chair of our academic partnership, on why further research is needed and the value add. Jude.
Thanks, Steph. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be here representing the academic board, which has the privilege of providing a kind of critical accompaniment to the Learning for Consortia programme. So I think we're all aware of the burgeoning interest in multi-stakeholder partnerships and the extensive literature on collaboration across national, sectoral, disciplinary borders. And Darian's just given us a really good overview of some of the benefits of partnerships and what works in theory. I'm sure many of us have seen the great examples or case studies of individual partnerships which have either been particularly successful or raised challenges around how to work collaboratively. But to date, there have been limited opportunities to look analytically across a host of large scale and very complex boundary spanning consortia. to really get to grips with why certain efforts are or aren't working. And that's why, for me, and I think I can speak for my colleagues on the academic board, that's why this particular program is so exciting. So I'd like to share with you today our participatory research approach, which involves working across the 13 UK AIDS Connect consortia through 4 iterative phases. First of all, to unpack the foundational models, definitions, frameworks, and understandings of consortia working, and of our core themes of value for money, innovation, gender, and community engagement that have shaped in different ways the UK AIDS Connect programmes and the consortia experiences within them. Second, to understand these specific consortia experiences. So how the unique composition of each of the different consortia, their relationships, their setup, their governance structures, things that we'll be discussing later on today, and their different understandings of context and engagement with context, how all of this has affected their experiences, and how these experiences have evolved in response to changing context, new learning, and world events, not least COVID, but also other crises which have affected the countries in which the consortia are operating, as well as in the UK context, Brexit and the recent DFID FCDO merger, as well as changes to overseas development assistance policy here in the UK, which have implications for funding. So third, we plan to draw on these experiences from consortia, as well as the broader literature, to critically engage with the models and redesign new approaches, models, and definitions of consortia working and the associated themes in order to better enable effective but also equitable and sustainable practice and outcomes. And finally, we'll be exploring the implications of these renewed models for a variety of stakeholders and looking to develop resources which might strengthen multiple stakeholder engagements in future consortia. So this is a participatory and a learning-oriented process, and we very much hope that you'll join us on this journey. Please look out for updates to the programme, and do feel free to get in touch if you would like to be involved with this process. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks Jude, and thanks Darian. So we're now going to move into what we are learning from this process, and I'm going to hand over to Ruth Finley, who is going to introduce the first session and take us through the next hour.
Thank you very much, Steph. I hasten to add I'm not going to talk for an hour, but I am going to introduce 2 of my colleagues who will be leading you through a process to start hearing about some of the things that we've been finding out from the consortia. So welcome to session 1, everybody. It's great to see you all here. As I said, I'm Ruth Findlay. I work with the Partnering Initiative, and on this particular programme, I am leading on the research side of things from TPI's perspective. So far, it's been a really interesting process. We've learned a lot already from the consortium, and we're really looking forward to sharing some of that with you. So first of all, just to reiterate, as Steph mentioned at the beginning, this session is being recorded and the breakouts will also be recorded. So I hope everybody's okay with that. The plus side is that it does mean that whichever breakout you are not in, you'll be able to watch it afterwards if you're interested in both the topics. So whilst our research with the UK Connect Consortia is still at quite an early stage, what is already becoming very clear is the importance of building really strong foundations for these complex collaborative structures. The 13 consortia in this programme have been very generous with us in sharing their experiences of setting up and launching the consortia during what has been the most turbulent period that many of us have experienced. If we imagine the collaboration process as a kind of cycle, what happens in the first stage of planning and setup sets the scene for what follows. The UK Consortia have tackled this in quite a range of ways, so we can learn a lot from how these approaches have played out in the different examples. So during this upcoming session, we're going to explore 2 elements of this setup process. The first of these is co-creation. This is the period of collaboratively designing how the consortium will run and how the partners will work together. The second of the topics we're going to look at is governance. So this is the structure, of course, that underlies and manages the consortium and its work. And as I said, both of these have been tackled differently across the range of UK Connect consortia. So in this session, my colleagues Rachel Houghton and Joe Perez, who've been working very closely with the consortia over the last several months, are going to be sharing and discussing with you what we've learned about the results and the implications of these approaches. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Rachel and Joe to introduce the topics of co-creation and governance. And after these presentations, you'll be joining one or two parallel sessions to explore the topics further. So just before we do that, just can I ask you to take 2 minutes? Lena, I'm hoping you're going to post in the chat a link to the first Mentimeter question. And if you could all just take 1 minute, 2 minutes, just to answer this question, which is really just to ask whether you have worked yourself in a consortium or in a partnership, or possibly both, just so we can get a sense of who is in the room. And once we have the answers to this, we will move on to the presentations from Rachel and from Joe. So if everyone can see that link in the chat, just click on that and put in your answers. And in a moment, Lena will bring up the slide and we'll be able to see what people are responding. So we should be able to see this, I'm told, in real time. Oh, this is exciting. I have not used Mentimeter before, so here we go. Quite a lot of people have been in both, fantastic. Some just in a consortium, some part of a partnership, but yeah, a lot of people have been involved in both. And just a small number have been involved in neither, but maybe proposing to, so maybe here to learn about it. So that's great, because that gives us a really good idea of who's in the room and the level of knowledge that you already have. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to hand over now to Rachel and Joe to introduce themselves and to tell you more about the topics of co-creation and governance. Over to you, Rachel.
Ruth. Yes, thank you, Ruth. Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to see so many of you. And as Ruth mentioned, my name is Rachel Houghton, and I'm one of 4 advisors, so-called consortium working advisors, that have been hired by TPI for the Learning from Consortium programme. And Joe, where are you? Do you also want to give a hello?
Hello, everyone.
And I'm going to be handing over. I'm going to be talking first about co-creation. I've been handing over to Joe, who's going to be talking about consortium governance. Okay, so let me bring up the slides I have prepared for us all today. Right, just figuring how long I've got. So, yeah, I'm going to be presenting today on some findings and recommendations from the early phase of the UK Aid Connect programme, namely the co-creation phase. And my objectives, really, or the presentation has 2 objectives. One is to provide some practical guidance to those who are thinking of setting up consortia. And then the second objective is very much to make some recommendations to the donor community about what it would take to support effective co-creation phase. In terms of sources for the findings and recommendations, some of these have been mentioned already, but primarily it's going to be a big health check process that the 4 advisors undertook with all the 13 consortium between October and March of this year, which consisted of a quantitative survey and accompanying qualitative interviews. Also a survey that was undertaken specifically on early stage co-creation last year by UK Aid Connect, and specific literature review on consortium working undertaken for the programme, as well as a number of third-party sources, and of course building on TPI's extensive experience of supporting partnerships and consortia over 20 years. So co-creation may be familiar to some, to others it may not be, and some of you may well be asking, what is exactly co-creation? So FCDO funded an intensive co-creation phase of up to 9 months, And the UK Connect business case stipulated that co-creation needed to include very much the programmatic aspects around identifying tangible outcomes, outputs, indicators, milestones, and a theory of change, assessing the evidence base for each of the consortium interventions, developing a comprehensive communication plan around putting evidence into action, fairly standard sort of risk assessment and mitigation, finalising who would be in the consortium as required, and also it stipulated that the FCDO policy teams would be fully involved in co-creation. And this essentially gets us to the idea that co-creation is actually a phase, so a discrete, time-bound, clearly defined phase. The main phase, the main first phase, if you like, of consortium building, the design phase. But it's also not just about co-designing the programme, it's also about establishing structures, processes, and ways of working. But importantly, our proposition is that co-creation isn't just a phase, it's also a philosophy and approach. In other words, it's about tackling key issues and activities together. So it's also about a way of working. And very much in order to optimise the precious benefits of consortium working and to ensure that they outweigh the real transaction costs of actually working collaboratively, our proposition is that consortia need to focus careful attention on co-creation as a philosophy and approach, as much as a discrete, time-bound and clearly defined phase. And hopefully the reasons why will become evident throughout this short presentation. So the early UCAC survey looked specifically, as I said, at co-creation and early implementation. It found a number of things. First of all, that the co-creation phase was very welcome and indeed essential, particularly with regard to providing space and time for good programme design and also relationship building. And the engagement with then DFID staff was really appreciated. And at the same time, it found that there was a lack of clarity about just what co-creation was, with an exhortation to make co-creation in future even more distinct. And there wasn't really a sense that there was a sort of detail or definition around what co-creation should actually involve, other than operational aspects. And the report also identified a number of external challenges and disablers, which we have heard ably about from previous speakers. It's a difficult context. Now, before I get on to how co-creation can be made more distinct, I just want to share with you some internal and external disablers to co-creation. So in the consortium or partnership, we really think that the context is absolutely everything, and that pretty much sits across two domains of both sort of internal factors and external factors. Now, on the internal side, there's internal issues with the participating organisation themselves and also in the consortia. So those need to be really addressed. Many organisations aren't actually optimised for consortium working, and that needs to be addressed. And then working in the consortium itself, you'll see a number of internal factors here that are found to be challenges, and this very much came through in the health check survey. I'll just allow you to look through those for a moment rather than reading them out. And then you'll see on the external disablers, we've already heard about those, and I don't think I need to go into that again, but very much, you know, the external operating environment for the UK Connect Consortia, as for many, of course, at the moment, is hugely challenging. Okay, so that was the preamble, and now let's get into the main part of this presentation, which is around creating strong foundations for co-creation. We found basically that the UK Aid Connect Consortia all employed a variety of different approaches to co-creation, and this was very much based on their individual understanding and experience of co-creation in partnership or consortia previously, and also in terms of their individual partnering competencies. We also found that those that had specific consortium building and sort of partnering competencies fared better than those that were entirely new to consortium working, and those that focused on processes in parallel to programme management and defining the programme early on were actually able to establish stronger relationships and working approaches, and this has really served them well over time. leading us to be able to recommend a number of foundations that have been gleaned from good practice from both within the UK Connect Consortia and also is supplemented by, as mentioned earlier, TPI's extensive experience of gathering evidence about what works well in partnership and consortium building and the development of tools and approaches over time. So the first foundation is very much around co-creating shared vision and desired impact. Now, this might sound obvious, but it doesn't appear to be, actually. And even though UK Connect Consortia do all have a theory of change, which was part of their proposal development, the health check found a surprising lack of clarity in some consortia with regard to a common shared vision. And this is really like a North Star for any consortium or partnership, having a common shared vision, especially important when working in very complex multi-level, multi-sector consortium structures, such as those of the UK Aid Connect consortia. And really, having a compelling shared vision is absolutely fundamental to delivering net benefit to all partners. So this is really kind of a very important starting point. Second foundation is around establishing the added value of working together rather than individually and right from the outset. So we have found that the more aligned the UK Connect partners were in terms of their ambition for collaboration and the pursuit of the added value of working together, the greater their chance has been of achieving this. And actually, it's very important for consortia to focus very much on the sum of the parts from very early on, because this can maximize the transformational potential of their work over time and of their joint action. This is really backed up by the collaboration literature, which actually strongly backs the notion that for systems level change to occur, there has to be a proactive goal and intentionality by all partners. And equally with respect to innovation, which is really important to the UK Connect Consortia, unless the consortium come together with the specific intent to innovate and they clarify this together up front, it's unlikely that the conditions for innovation are going to be optimized. The third foundation is ensuring mutuality, essentially, and that individual members can support each other to achieve their individual as well as their collective goals. And this speaks to a really important aspect of alignment within consortium working. Now, mutual benefit is actually rapidly being recognised as a glue for maintaining consortium commitment. Those consortia that were able to identify early on how their members could actually meet their own individual organisational goals while in parallel contributing to the overall goals of the consortium, they essentially have been able to bring much greater mutual benefit to the whole consortium and the different partners. And this has really helped to solidify the commitment of the members in the UK Connect Consortium where this has been done. Establishing mutual benefit, we could call this win-win, is really important, and also can be seen in terms of sharing risks and rewards. And one of the rationale for consortium working, and indeed for FCDO's interest in consortia, is that shared risk and reward will actually support greater innovation. And the experience of consortia conclude that the more members can reap in terms of rewards, then again their commitment that they bring to the consortium is very much supported. Another way of thinking about mutual benefit is that consortium members can benefit from each other's discrete areas of expertise and basically helping each other to raise overall standards, either through the transfer of skills within the consortium or also indeed to individual organisations. So there's a sort of levelling up from working in partnership and from working jointly. Foundation 4 is about identifying clear roles and responsibilities. Now, again, this might sound really, really obvious, but very much in partnership and consortia, it's so critical to actually do this. And a number of the UK Connect consortia commented that in co-creation, it was actually difficult to harness each other's expertise because roles and responsibilities weren't actually clear. And for some, this still continues due to the sheer complexity of the consortia. So it's really important to revisit this over time as well, and not just think about it as being important in the co-creation phase. Now, when roles and responsibilities are actually clearly defined, it's also much easier to make optimal use of each member's unique skills, of perspectives and resources, and partners can actually are better able to understand and accept the rationale for sort of the division of labour in the consortium, if you like. So really important to do early on. Fifth is co-creating principles, essentially, and values of the consortium culture, because in a consortium, the behaviour of members really very much creates the consortium culture and underpins everything that a consortium does. So intentionally choosing operating principles and their associated behaviours really enable consortia to foster a strong values-based culture. And the findings from the health check that we undertook demonstrated that those that had focused early on doing this actually fared much better when it came to pivoting during COVID, for instance, due to the strong level of trust and mutual understanding that was delivered by actually focusing on this. And so just spending time, on discussing respective values is so important. And it can also help consortia in the early days to actually recognise potential difference and conflict between their different mandates, ways of working, and perhaps language and assumptions, and therefore to come to a common understanding on some of these things, and even take mitigating actions or think about that early on. The next foundation is actually on governance, which is around developing inclusive governance approach around structures and processes and behaviours, which I won't speak to because Joe's going to be getting onto that. And the seventh foundation is around discussing and agreeing leadership modalities early on. This is important because it really takes proactive effort to mitigate the tendency towards a sort of more hierarchical approach in consortium working, identified by Darian earlier on. And this has really helped if the lead agency is kind of very much aware of the potential to actually share and distribute leadership, and again having a conversation about this early on and where that can be appropriate within the confines of consortium model, i.e. with a lead agency with financial responsibility. This is actually really important. Coming on to the foundation 8, which is around a learning culture. Learning in a consortium needs to range across programmatic aspects and also consortium ways of working. So it's not just about the programmatic aspect, because if you don't also look at ways of working and learn about what works and what makes an effective consortium, you can really impede your outcomes. I won't go into more detail there to move us on more quickly. Then foundation 9 is actually about supporting the consortia to work well. Through the employment potentially of a consortium or partnership broker, animator, capacity builder, whatever you like to say. But the point here is that working in a consortium or partnership doesn't happen with good intent alone. And actually, we found that in the UK Connect Consortia, those that had these skills and capacities really have been faring better. So think about doing that in the early phases of setting up. And then finally, we would recommend that early on consortia co-create not just a consortium-wide work plan and governance structures, but also agree internal and external communications, including how agency logos will be used, which sounds really simplistic, but actually it can really create problems once it comes to communicating out in terms of what the consortium is doing. Very, very quickly then, if I have time, Ruth, is to get on to a series of recommendations to donors. The first of which is around clarifying and communicating the importance of co-creation as an investment. So this will really help to optimize program outcomes over time if there is a good co-creation phase. It will also really help to enhance the potential for innovation and value for money. And we found with the health check that the funding changes following co-creation very much meant that a number of processes had to be repeated, and the value added of the kind of early co-creation was impeded. So really important to kind of do this well early on. It's also a point of ensuring co-creation is clearly defined and that consortia understand it's also a philosophy and approach as well as a process, as well as a phase in terms of program design. And finally, here we need to make sure that it's funded, and this was really seen as key to success, and this came out in both the health check and the earlier survey. Then it's about ensuring consortia are intentional about their added value. I talked about that earlier on as one of the key foundations, so I won't get into that now. But donors can really help to guide consortia as well around identifying added value and making sure that they identify and balance the program focus early on with the consortium building aspects. And also, sorry,
but you are absolutely out of time.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. So yes, the last set there are all about well, you can see making funding, we suggest conditional best practice of budget and process transparency, because this can really impede consortium working over time. The other two here relate to traditional value for money appropriateness. Is it appropriate to have that as a framework for consortia, and stable and predictable funding? So without further ado, I'll hand over to Joan. Sorry for the rush at the end there.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Rachel. So I'm going to, I'm also one of the TPI advisors, and I'm excited to be talking to you a little bit about governance. I know that excitement and governance don't usually go together in the same sentence, but it's actually quite fascinating. So let me just share my screen with you. So firstly, what is consortium governance? So when we're looking at governance, we have to try and remember what we've got is we've got a sort of disparate group of organizations coming together to try and deliver a program. And consortium governance actually can be seen as the structures, processes, and behaviors that hold them together in some sense, that enable them to work together. And often, I think we're quite familiar with a governance structure. We might know we need to put that in, and we might be thinking about processes, but often behaviors are left out because they seem like perhaps they're sort of not formal enough. But actually what we see is that the interplay between the structures, processes, and behaviors that consortia put in place really make a big difference. So we've got cogs here, and you can see that perhaps if the structures and processes are not aligned, if they don't fit well together, then the machine, if you like, can't work as effectively. It gets clogged up. And similarly, if there is alignment between structures, processes, and behaviors, then that machine can work a little bit more smoothly. So if I take an example of decision making, you may well have in your consortium a platform of maybe a steering group or some working groups, and you have a certain decision-making spaces and fora, and you may even have processes that determine, you know, we're going to decide this by majority vote, or we're going to decide this by consent or consensus. But ultimately, if the behaviors that are prevalent within a consortia is that that decision that takes place in the corridor or somewhere else, or that those are not used, then it doesn't really matter. It can mess up a really great structure. And so what we see is that there needs to be this alignment between these sort of component parts. And that can be quite tricky. Also, what we see is that the interplay between these different pieces informs the leadership and management culture and the cohesiveness of the consortium. And similarly, the leadership and management culture of the lead and of the organizations on the consortium informs their choice of process, structures, and behaviors. So there's this interplay. So in some sense, the consortium governance sort of determines and sets up and leads you down a road towards what kind of culture you're going to be working in. And now what we see is that in consortia, as it's been mentioned before, there's an inherent tension between two governance cultures. On the one hand, traditional grant and project management process and structures, which is typified by, for example, the lead agency to a donor, a grantee to a sub-grantee, and within line management within organizations and our relationships with client contracts and vendors. It's a sort of normal way of working in some ways, a sort of conventional way of working. However, in a collaborative and decentralized approach, partners and members see themselves as more than contractors. They're partners with each other rather than in a sort of hierarchical framework. They feel like they want to be more than the sum of the parts. And often we're looking at sort of Southern agencies as partners. So these two different ways of working, these different consortia cultures bring with them different expectations about what kind of structures there will be, what the processes will be, how people will behave, but also what kind of outcomes you might get. So for example, depending on which one you're expecting, you'll have a different expectation about power sharing and who gets to decide what, around project management style and partnership management process and how that will happen, around co-working culture and pace also, but also around value creation and value exchange between partners, and that's been discussed a little bit before. And also how adaptive the programming will be, and therefore how open to change people will be. So actually, it matters a lot in terms of what people are expecting and how relationships can run. So what we see is that these two, now this is a framework that is an existing TPI framework, but what we can see is the consortium is this hybrid. On the one hand, it has the lead agency structure, but it's also a collaborative vehicle. So what we see on the left, and the consortium spans both, it's a hybrid. And what we see is that consortia are using different pieces of different ways of working for different things. So on the left, what you can see is a conventional way that we operate, business as usual, where one party generally gets to decide the terms of engagement, set a COR, potentially ultimately purchasing services from others. The accountability tends to be one way, going with where the money goes, and that's true for many of our business relationships, often based on formal contracts. So this works really well when everyone knows what they're doing and they stay in their comfort zones, and you're doing things that have been pre-agreed and aren't necessarily going to change. However, what we see on the left, the collaborative approaches, these are a very unconventional way of working. They're not our norm. And it's more decentralized and equitable. Instead of one party sort of determining terms and the rules of engagement, that's generated together, as Rachel's discussed a little bit before, in terms of co-creation. And people bring together based on their different experiences and perspectives and co-create the body of work together. They're pooling their resources and offered layered relationships. And they create new ways of working. It's not that there are established ways of working, and that's what Rachel also pointed to. And accountability is mutual, not only to each other, but then often to communities that are the sort of targets for the programs. And whereas transactional ways of working, or our normal ways of working, often are based on contracts, what we can see as collaborative ways of working are thrive on trust and mutual benefit. What is the value that the organizations get above and beyond money, for example? So there's a greater value exchange being looked for. Now, consortium, as I said, are spanning both of these, as using these, and there are advantages to each using both. So in transactional approaches, it's well-defined and manageable. It's lower administration and management costs. It's very clear decision-making. One person gets to decide. It's predictable processes and outcomes, clear lines of authority, and there isn't such a clash, or there isn't the need for organizations' culture to come together in such the way, that organizational ways of working. And it's an efficient mechanism for distribution. And then if we do it well, if we do it well, the collaborative approaches actually give us this opportunity for these sort of more implementable, more appropriate solutions, because they've been crafted drawing in on everybody's perspective and that broader systems-based awareness that was discussed, Darian mentioned in the opening. There's a sense of better informed decision making. Again, you're gleaning from across lots of different perspectives, and a wider potential for influence and change. And what we can see is it's actually a vehicle that lends itself for innovation and learning. So these are some of the advantages. There are a lot of disadvantages too for both of these. And what Rachel mentioned before, that actually collaborative approaches do take a lot more time and effort. So, and they're not business as usual. So it can be it can be quite difficult. So here's a quote from one of the consortium members, who says, whether you have 10% of funding and 90% of activities, or 90% of funding and 10% of activities, everyone at a governance level should have equal say in specified decisions. Otherwise, you're just providing a service to the lead organization, rather than governing the accountability of the outcomes you seek to address. And I think this is a wonderful quotation to just point to the difference. There are wonderful efficiencies one can get through a standard way of operating, but then it's service provision. it's transactional. Whereas when we try and go for more collaborative approaches, actually those partners are governing the outcomes. And that's a very different stake and a different role. And so we need to manage it. And therefore, we need to understand it's important how partners are feeling and which governance structure we're putting in place and processes and behaviors. So the learning we have from UK Aid Connect is that it really is a hybrid, and that consortia are trying their best to mix and match the different types of process and structure to deliver as best they can. However, there is little clarity right now about how to select, deploy and manage these different structures and processes and cultures. They kind of tend to bleed into one another, and that can be very confusing, not only around expectations, but also it can also erode trust if you think something's going to be one way and then it's another way. And so what we see is that despite lots of best efforts, this lack of clarity of knowing which governance structure they're in any one given moment can cause upset. That said, there are still nonetheless a number of effective and innovative collaborative governance practices that we're seeing in UK Aid Connect Consortia as they innovate and try and figure out what is the best mechanism here to get our desired outcomes. So just very quickly, some top tips. I'm going to let you read through these because it'll be faster, but essentially these are about structures. And I'd just like to draw attention to the bottom two, which talk about these sort of pop-up governance that are responsive to need, and the possibility of testing them. Because what the learning has really been is that actually you can have a wonderful structure on paper, but actually the only way of testing it is to get involved with it and test it and see what works and find out what's not working and then make changes. So I'm just going to move on now in the interest of time. These are some of the processes that consortia, and these have come directly from consortia members themselves in terms of, the kinds of processes that you need to get clarity on and the kind of granularity that you want to get to. So I'll again let you just read those momentarily. So this understanding how much detail we kind of want to get into discussing. And this is why it's great to have a co-creation process where you can have these conversations and put these things in place, again, recognizing that they will need to iterate as you go. So lastly, just on behaviors, recognizing this is the part that's often forgotten. And it's really about intentionally developing a culture and modeling the kind of leadership and facilitation that we want, and finding ways to create trust and redress imbalances of power. And particularly at the moment, finding creative ways of connecting. It can be very difficult to get straight down to business as usual, particularly in these contexts. And so listening and communicating, particularly when we're working remotely and people are in such dangerous and scary situations is important, and taking each time to explore their approach. So these are just some of the top tips coming from consortia. Like I said, this is really about, this is another quote, they're saying, take the time to find the best governance, evolve it organically and experimentally. There is no need to have a rigid setup at the beginning. And if it's not working, change it. So I think the main thing that we can see is that it really matters. And so it's worth taking the time to explore. So in the next session, I'm going to be inviting you to some input into some emerging thinking about consortium governance. And you will have signed up for a breakout group when you registered. And so you'll either be going into a governance breakout group or you'll be going into the co-creation breakout group. And so my invitation, if you haven't, if you want to switch group, please do stay in the plenary and then you can be reassigned. Otherwise, you will be putting, yes, Rachel.
Just one quick thing. So I just wanted to let everyone know that if you're coming into co-creation, there are going to be a couple of additional speakers. We have got Daniel McCartney from the Access Consortium, so one of the UK Connect Consortium, and also Anne-Marie van Bulwy. I hope I've got that right, Anne-Marie. Maybe you can give a wave, Anne-Marie. And also Daniel, if you can give a wave as well. And Anne-Marie is an associate of TPI and has an extensive track record in the partnering and consortium space, including with the Dutch MFA. So they will be in the breakout room with me.
So as Jude mentioned earlier on in the program, the Learning from Consortia program works across a number of areas, one of which is innovation and adaptation. So I'm the academic advisor. My name is Jody Delight, working on innovation and adaptation. So what we're doing is we're exploring the ways consortia are innovating and adapting, as well as looking at what enables them and inhibits them from doing this. So the UK aid consortia, as with most, have recently been impacted not only by the COVID-19 pandemic, but also funding cuts. And they've had to adapt to these changing circumstances to ensure they continue to progress, to maintain relevance, and to deliver impact. So in this second session, we'll be exploring how the consortia have adapted to these two circumstances in separate breakout sessions. So in the first, in one session, we'll explore how consortia have adapted to COVID-19 through a case study of Inclusion Works, and that will be presented by Simon Brown, who's the Global Technical Lead of Economic Empowerment at Sightsavers, the consortium's lead partner. And the other session will explore what we can learn from how the consortia have adapted to funding cuts. So the session will be facilitated by Zoe Abrahamson, a senior funding advisor at Bond, and it includes two guest speakers from Restless Development, which is the lead partner of the Development Alternative Consortium, and that is Lily McCall-McGuire, who is the Youth Leadership and Design Senior Manager at Restless Development, and Belen Giaquinta, who is their Senior Grant Manager. So myself and Zoe will just spend a few minutes now, each of us, to summarize the key points from each session before we move into the breakout sessions. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. Quickly. So I'm going to talk about how consortia have adapted in response to COVID-19. So we have actually just put together a nice two-pager that summarizes this. And I think at the end of the event, everyone is going to receive a summary as well as links to this document. So you will be able to access it. So what we've done is we've looked at how the different consortia have adapted in response to COVID-19. And we've looked at how COVID-19 has impacted them and has impacted their work. So we've seen that the realities and the needs of the target communities they work with have rapidly changed. Populations that were already marginalized have become further marginalized. Key stakeholders like government, healthcare workers, and other key stakeholders have shifted their focus to COVID-19. And of course, the ways of working, the planned ways of working, just can't be done in the same way anymore. So on the ground work, there's lockdowns and travel restrictions and things like that. So we've seen that the consortia have adapted sort of in three main types, right? So they've adapted how they work with the target communities. They've adapted how they work with key stakeholders, such as governments, NGOs, CSOs, and adapted how they work with consortium partners, so with each other. So I won't go through this in a lot of detail because I'm just going to summarize, and I want to make sure we have enough time for the breakouts, and you will be able to access this. But in terms of working with target communities, we've seen things like getting involved in COVID-19 awareness building or including that into existing activities. We've seen delivery and distribution of hygiene kits and safety kits, and even helping with water infrastructure in local communities. So really trying to kind of adapt to the immediate needs of the target communities. And many of the consortia have done impact and needs assessments to try to understand how COVID-19 is impacting their target communities and where they need to focus, and continually tracking what's happening in the context. And some are even doing rumor tracking to understand what information they're receiving and what misinformation they might be receiving as well. And of course, on the ground activities have had to be pivoted. So in some cases, this has been pivoting to remote or online mediums, which may be mobile loudspeakers for information dissemination, or the use of radio, mobile phones to try to gather data, or use of things like Facebook or WhatsApp. And then on the ground activities that have continued have had to be done in smaller groups, or of course, using face masks, social distancing, and all those things we're very familiar with nowadays. And in some cases, some activities have had to be prioritized or paused. So in terms of work with key stakeholders, there's been a lot of emphasis on really trying to raise awareness of the impact of COVID-19 on the target communities, and convening these different stakeholders to discuss the impact and response. And in some cases also facilitating dialogue and even development of different partnerships between diverse stakeholders. So this includes, for example, developing partnerships with leaders and healthcare facilities. As well as identifying some different best practices and developing policy briefs and things like that. So with respect to working with consortium partners, I think we're all aware, we're all on a Zoom event right now. So Zoom has become our world, or Teams, or things like that. So shifting to that remote and online working, and a lot of increased emphasis on really trying to share what's going on, what are we learning, what are we seeing, what do we need to do, and more reliance on in-country partners, because there's not that ability to travel as easily anymore. And there's even been things like partner training to help facilitate adaptation. So how do you do things online? How do you work with target communities online? So there has been a number of challenges, but also a number of benefits with respect to these adaptations. So with respect to the challenges, a lot of what's come up is primarily around the quality of the interactions. So where in-person interactions have been able to continue, they are obviously with social distancing or with the use of masks. So where you might have had big group events before to sort of gather data or opinions, now it's smaller groups with social distancing, and sometimes that can impact the quality of the interactions, as can the use of online. So sometimes you don't have that same level of bonding that you would have with in-person events and activities, and also they can exclude some people, or you can have issues with different time zones and device and connectivity issues, as I'm sure we're all aware and familiar with connectivity issues sometimes. But in terms of the benefits, there have been a number of benefits that have been identified with respect to the target community. So the consortia have been able to address the community's most pressing concerns, and that has helped strengthen relationships on the ground. And they've also been able to increase community inclusion in both communication and response around COVID-19 by raising awareness directly with the communities themselves, as well as with the key stakeholders. And although online does have its challenges, there have been some benefits as well that have been noted. So some people have said, well, actually, community members are more free to express themselves because they're doing it online now. So they're more free to say what they really think, rather than when they're with a group of people. And in some cases, it's provided greater reach and efficiency. So more people have been able to be involved in training activities than perhaps previously. And in terms of the consortium benefits, doing things like the impact and needs assessments has been able to help the consortia identify the potential innovations and interventions and adaptations that they need to deliver. They have been able to strengthen some relationships and even develop new forms of collaboration through some of the convenings and dialogues that have taken place because of COVID-19. And with respect to working in partnership and with the consortium partners, there have actually been some positive benefits around more inclusivity and equality, because now more people can be involved in different events or different meetings. And of course, value for money would come up because people aren't traveling through virtual working. So one of the things that we've done is we've really tried to dig more into what's enabled these adaptations. So what allows and enables these consortia to adapt during these changing circumstances. And it's interesting because some of these things you would have heard came up when Rachel and Joe presented earlier in the event. So that diverse range of partners with different combinations of skills, experience, and resources. I think it was Joe that talked about the importance of collaboration and how that enables adaptation. And Rachel earlier talked about that culture of learning and openness and that ability to challenge existing assumptions, approaches, and solutions. And I believe one of them also mentioned strong communication and the importance of trust among consortium members. Some of the consortia talked about how they actually have flexibility built into the program design. And because they already had that built in, it enabled them to adapt more readily when COVID-19 hit. Some consortia talked about existing experience dealing with crises, which helped, and access to capabilities and resources, like, for example, existing digital platforms. And of course, good relationships with and support from donor organizations that enable that adaptation and make adaptation okay. So I'll leave it there. Again, you will have access to this. And Simon, in the session on COVID-19, will talk more about some of these and how inclusion works adapted. But for now, I shall let Zoe give you some highlights from the funding challenge session.
Thanks, Jodie, and good afternoon, everybody. As Jodie said, I'm going to be chairing the other breakout session that is looking at the impact of funding cuts on consortia. And in particular, we're going to be looking at the cuts to UK aid that happened towards over the summer of last year and are now going through that same process again at the moment. So some of most of you, I think, will probably know that in the summer of 2020, so last year, the UK government made cuts to the UK aid budget as a result of the drop in GNI. So that's the drop of kind of money here in the UK, therefore meant that our 0.7% contribution was lower. So that resulted in about £2.9 billion worth of cuts to UK aid programming, including some of the UK Aid Connect consortia. And then we're now going, because the government has said that we're going to be dropping our commitment to overseas development aid from 0.7% now down to 0.5%. A lot of UK Aid Connect grantees and consortia are going through that same process right now. So what we're going to be hearing from Restless Development, who are one of the UK Aid Connect consortia leads, and they're going to be explaining a little bit about how what they did during the first process and now what they've learned going into the second round of cuts. And then there'll be an opportunity to ask them some questions towards the end.